11 weeks. That's how long they waited. 11 weeks of silence, patience, and discipline. Listening to the electromagnetic pulse of Russia's most fortified air defense corridor without firing a shot, without moving a vehicle, without triggering a single Russian sensor sweep back in their direction. 11 weeks of harvesting the invisible architecture of an enemy that believed itself untouchable. Then, on one night in early June 2026, 4 radar nodes went dark across a 90-kilometer arc of northern Crimea. The window lasted 38 minutes. Ukraine didn't need more than that. I'm your host at War Vector, where we analyze the battles that change wars. This is the story of how a team of fewer than a dozen SBU signals intelligence operators, working from a concealed forward position in the Kherson region, dismantled Russia's confidence in its own air defense network, and opened a corridor that Russian planners had spent 2 years insisting was physically impossible to breach. This isn't a story about missiles raining down on a convoy. It's not about FPV drones threading through a tree line at dawn. It's about something quieter, more dangerous, and in many ways more decisive. The systematic mapping of an enemy's electronic nervous system until you understand it well enough to switch it off. By the time Russian radar operators realized what was happening, the damage was done. The corridor was open. Ukraine's long-range drones were already 40 kilometers inside Crimea's northern approach. Here's how it happened. And here's what it tells us about where this war is actually being won. To understand what the SBU cell accomplished, you have to understand what they were up against. By spring 2026, Russia had spent the better part of 18 months rebuilding and reinforcing its air defense architecture over Crimea after devastating Ukrainian strikes in 2024 and early 2025 had exposed critical gaps. The S-400 Triumph batteries positioned at Jonkoy were the spine of that system. Long-range engagement radars capable of tracking targets out to 600 kilometers, with fire control precision to engage low-altitude threats at altitudes as low as 10 meters under optimal conditions. Flanking those S-400 nodes along the Sivash lake system, Russian engineers had positioned a layered network of shorter-range radar pickets. Podlet K, 1 low-altitude detection systems, 96 L6 acquisition radars, and the older but still operationally relevant Nebo-M VHF radar complexes that Russia had pushed forward specifically because their long-wavelength emissions could theoretically detect the low radar cross-section drones Ukraine had been deploying with increasing lethality. On paper, that corridor was impenetrable. Russian commanders said so openly. Garrison briefings at Simferopol in March 2026, later partially reconstructed through intercepted communications reviewed by Ukrainian GUOR analysts, described the northern Crimea approach as a closed electromagnetic envelope. The phrase appears multiple times. The confidence was real. Russia had layered passive detection, active radar, and electronic warfare assets into a mutually supporting network that, according to its own doctrine, left no exploitable gap wider than 8 kilometers. Too narrow for a meaningful drone strike package to transit without being acquired, tracked, and engaged. What Russian commanders didn't account for was that Ukraine wasn't trying to find the gaps. Ukraine was building the map that would let them create one. The SBU signals intelligence cell that deployed to the forward technical position in the Kherson region arrived in 3 separate movements in mid-February 2026. The team moved in small groups, using civilian vehicles and pre-established cover identities for the border zones. Their equipment, passive radio frequency receivers, spectrum analyzers, directional antenna arrays, had been staged in advance through a logistics chain that kept the actual purpose of each component ambiguous until assembly. Ukrainian counterintelligence had spent considerable effort on that staging process. Russia's FSB presence in Kherson Oblast remained active even in Ukrainian-controlled areas. One compromised link in that chain, and the mission ended before it started. The position itself had been selected 3 months earlier by a GUOR reconnaissance team that never directly engaged with the SBU cell. The site offered line-of-sight electromagnetic exposure to the Sivash corridor while remaining under terrain masking that limited Russian counter-direction finding options. There was no power grid access. The team ran on generator power with strict duty cycles. Engines on for 6-hour windows, off for 18, to minimize acoustic and thermal signature. Water and food rotations happened at irregular intervals through a separate logistics chain. Nothing about the position was convenient. Everything about it was deliberate. For the first 3 weeks of operation, the cell collected nothing usable. That's the part that almost never makes it into the reporting on signals intelligence operations. The enormous stretches of apparently empty data that precede any meaningful pattern recognition. Russian radar systems don't operate on fixed schedules. They vary their emission profiles, switch between active and passive modes, rotate frequencies, and periodically go silent to avoid exactly the kind of passive harvesting the Ukrainian team was conducting. Experienced operators know this. They log the silences as carefully as they log the emissions. The shape of an air defense network's silence tells you almost as much as its noise. Which weapon do you think drove Russia's radar operators to change their emission patterns most aggressively in early 2026? Was it A, long-range Storm Shadow cruise missiles, B, FPV drone swarms at low altitude, or C, Ukrainian electronic warfare jamming platforms? Think about it. The answer shapes everything that follows. Comment below. By week 4, patterns began to emerge. The 96L6 acquisition radar at Node Bravo, Ukrainian targeting nomenclature for a position the team had geolocated to within 200 meters of a known Russian installation site northeast of Armyansk, operated on a 47-minute active cycle with a consistent 9-minute passive window. The Podlet K1 at Node Delta showed a similar but offset pattern, with its low-altitude coverage sector rotating through a 15-degree arc every 22 minutes. Individually, these were fragments. Overlaid on a common timeline, they revealed something more significant. The Russian network's coverage wasn't perfectly continuous. It was a rotating sequence of overlapping arcs, each transition point creating a momentary seam. Not a gap wide enough to exploit under normal circumstances, but a seam nonetheless. The critical discovery came in week 7. One detail from the raw logs that stuck with me when reviewing the documented account of this operation. The 96L6 at Node Bravo showed a consistent extended passive window on nights with significant atmospheric ducting conditions. Ducting, the phenomenon where temperature inversions in the lower atmosphere bend radar beams away from intended coverage zones, was already reducing Russian radar effectiveness during those periods. But the Node Bravo operators, apparently aware of the interference, had developed a habit of extending their passive cycles during ducting events, likely to avoid the false return clutter that plagued their displays. They were adapting to their environment. And in adapting, they were inadvertently broadcasting the rhythm of their own vulnerability. The SBU cell logged 23 separate ducting events between week 3 and week 11. Node Bravo's extended passive window correlated with ducting conditions in 19 of those 23 instances. The pattern was statistically significant enough that GUR analysts in Kiev, receiving the processed data through encrypted relay, began modeling predictive windows for future ducting events based on seasonal atmospheric data for the northern Crimea region. But here is where the operation nearly collapsed entirely. In the final week of April 2026, Russian signals intelligence assets, likely a direction-finding vehicle operating out of the Chonhar crossing area, began showing anomalous behavior on the electromagnetic monitoring feeds the SBU cell was passively observing. The Russian DF system wasn't tracking the cell directly, but it was operating in a pattern suggesting a search sweep, broad-spectrum direction-finding activity covering the Kherson bank of the Sivash in a methodical grid. Someone in the Russian signals chain had noticed something, not the cell itself, but possibly an anomalous emission from one of the cell's support logistics runs. A civilian vehicle that had briefly operated a commercial GPS device in a pattern inconsistent with normal agricultural activity in the area. The cell went completely dark for 11 days. No generator cycles, no transmission, no active systems of any kind. The team survived on pre-positioned supplies, maintained radio silence, and waited. Stay with me, because what happens in the next phase of this operation changes the entire equation for Russia's air defense over northern Crimea. The 11-day blackout served a dual purpose. It eliminated the immediate risk of the Russian DF sweep acquiring a usable signal, and it became the seed of something far more strategically valuable: the deliberate emission silence that Ukrainian planners would later weaponize as a deception tool. When the cell reactivated its passive collection systems in mid-May, Russian radar operators across the Sivash corridor showed no change in behavior. The search sweep had apparently been inconclusive. The threat assessment had apparently been downgraded, and the SBU cell had just observed something that no amount of electronic analysis could have generated: direct evidence that Russian operators had concluded the electromagnetic pressure from the Kherson bank had dissipated. What's most surprising about this phase isn't the technical discipline of the Ukrainian team. It's that Russia apparently never updated its threat assessment to account for the gap. 11 days of silence from a previously active collection zone, immediately preceded by a Russian DF search sweep, should have triggered heightened alert on the Russian side. It didn't. Russian Signals Command apparently categorized the silence as evidence that the Ukrainian collection asset had relocated, not that it had gone to ground. That assumption would cost them. Here's what this tells us about the state of Russian signals intelligence by mid-2026. The institutional capacity to synthesize pattern-of-life data across multiple collection streams. To notice that the silence was itself anomalous, had been degraded by 2 years of personnel attrition, equipment losses, and chronic under-resourcing of analytical functions in favor of kinetic operations. Russia's radar operators were watching their screens. Russia's DF teams were running their sweeps. But the human layer that would have connected those data points into a coherent threat picture was thinning. Ukraine had been targeting that layer deliberately, not just through strikes on signals infrastructure, but through the sustained pressure of operations exactly like this one, which forced Russian analysts to process more data than their reduced staffs could meaningfully evaluate. Subscribe to War Vector if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because this is the level at which the war in Ukraine is being decided. The Gior targeting package that arrived at the SBU cell's secure communications node on May 28, 2026, was built on 11 weeks of raw collection data, 3 weeks of analytical processing, and a predictive model validated against 23 historical atmospheric events. It identified 4 specific radar nodes: Bravo, Delta, Foxtrot, and Kilo in Ukrainian targeting nomenclature, whose simultaneous disruption would create a 90-kilometer-wide gap in the northern Crimea approach corridor lasting a predicted 38 to 45 minutes under the atmospheric conditions forecast for the night of June 3, 2026. The forecast showed a significant ducting event developing over the Sivash between 1:15 a.m. and 3 a.m. local time. The atmospheric modeling wasn't perfect, but it was good enough. The strike package wasn't kinetic in the traditional sense. This is the distinction that makes the operation doctrinally significant. Ukraine didn't target the physical radar infrastructure. It targeted the electronic emissions. The SBU cell's active jamming systems, compact, directional, specifically tuned to the frequency profiles of each of the 4 target nodes based on 11 weeks of passive collection, were designed not to destroy the radars but to blind them, saturate their receivers with precisely calibrated noise, introduce false return clutter and patterns matched to their individual filter algorithms, not kill the eye. Peel back the eyelid and flood it with light until seeing becomes impossible. How many radar nodes did Ukraine simultaneously disrupt to open the Crimea corridor? A, 2, B, 4, or C, 6? The answer tells you something important about the scale of this operation. We'll have it at the end. Getting the active jamming systems into position without triggering the Russian DF sweep response had been the subject of 6 weeks of planning at the Gior. The systems couldn't operate from the original collection site. The power requirements and emission signatures would have been immediately detectable. They needed to be deployed from multiple dispersed positions, coordinated through timing rather than direct communication, with each individual emitter too low-powered to constitute a clear acquisition target, but collectively powerful enough to saturate the target node's receivers. The solution involved 5 dispersed emitter positions, 3 of which were mobile, operating from agricultural vehicles that could move between positions during the operation's active phase. The other 2 were fixed, positioned in terrain features that provided natural absorption behind the emitters. Ukrainian long-range drone assets that would exploit the corridor had been staged in the Mykolaiv region for 6 days before the operation. The positioning was deliberate and observable enough for Russian reconnaissance to find it. Ukrainian forces had learned that Russian assets, particularly the Orlan-10 drones Russia operated extensively over the operational zone, would report the staging activity. The expectation was that Russia would assess the staging as preparation for a direct drone strike on Crimean infrastructure, the kind Ukraine had conducted multiple times before, and would activate their air defense network accordingly, running it at higher operational tempo and higher power output in the days before the actual operation. Higher tempo meant more emissions data for the SBU collection cell. It also meant Russian radar operators would be mentally calibrated for a different kind of threat than the one that was actually coming. Put yourself in the position of the Node Bravo radar operator on the night of June 3rd. You've been running elevated alert status for 6 days because your intelligence chain told you a Ukrainian drone strike package was staging in Mykolaiv. You've been watching your displays for the low-altitude, slow-moving contacts that characterize Ukraine's long-range drone approach profiles. You're tired. The ducting event is already creating clutter on your lower-altitude coverage bands. And then, at 1:22 a.m., your acquisition radar begins showing something that doesn't resolve into a coherent contact. Not a drone, not a missile, not a ghost return, but a spreading interference pattern that your filter algorithms can't classify. You report it up the chain. You wait for guidance. Guidance doesn't come quickly enough. The 5-emitter jamming package activated at 1:21 a.m. The timing was staggered. Node Bravo first, to trigger the reporting cycle and introduce delay into the Russian command response. Node Delta 40 seconds later, widening the affected sector. Nodes Foxtrot and Kilo at 1:23 a.m. and 1:24 a.m. respectively, completing the arc. The total activation sequence lasted 3 minutes and 11 seconds. The predicted coverage gap, the 90-kilometer-wide electromagnetic corridor through which Ukraine's long-range drones could transit without being acquired, tracked, or engaged by the Sivash corridor nodes, was open by 1:25 a.m. If you believe tactics and intelligence win wars, not just firepower, type War Vector in the comments. The long-range drone package that entered the corridor consisted of assets that Ukrainian forces declined to specify, consistent with operational security practices that had become standard by early 2026. OSINT tracking and subsequent satellite imagery analysis, cross-referenced against Ukrainian General Staff reports, indicated a minimum of 12 assets transiting the corridor in 2 waves during the 38-minute window. The first wave, entering at 1:27 a.m., targeted a fuel storage complex on the western outskirts of Jankoy, a logistics node that Russian forces had been using as a staging point for resupply convoys supporting the Kherson front. The second wave, entering at 1:41 a.m., struck a communications relay station that Ukrainian intelligence had assessed as a critical node in the Russian military's secure communications backbone for southern operations. Here's the thing about the 38-minute window that makes this operation so instructive. Russia didn't figure out what was happening until minute 19. 11 minutes into the window, Russian Signals Command was still processing the interference reports from the 4 blinded nodes as a possible equipment malfunction or atmospheric anomaly. It was only when a 5th radar node, one outside the targeted arc, began reporting drone contacts transiting what should have been a covered approach sector that the assessment shifted from technical fault to active electronic attack. By then, the first wave of Ukrainian drones was already past the 40-kilometer mark inside the Crimean approach corridor. And here's the new problem Russia faced. Blinded in 4 sectors, they couldn't confidently track the inbound contacts even after they recognized the attack was in progress. The S-400 batteries at Jankoy could engage targets in their own radar coverage zone. But the coverage zone was degraded, the acquisition track quality was poor, and Russian doctrine for engaging targets in electronically contested environments required confirmation from secondary sensors. Those secondary sensors were 4 of the 4 nodes currently saturated with jamming. The S-400S could see fragments of the contact picture. They could not build the engagement quality tracks their fire control systems needed. 2 missiles were fired. Both missed. Ukrainian sources, citing combat footage and independent tracking data, confirmed this. The intercepted communications fragments that GUR released in redacted form 3 days after the operation included what analysts assessed as a request from the Jankoy S-400 battery commander for permission to fire without secondary sensor confirmation. The request was denied. By the time the decision chain reversed that call, the drone package had transited the engagement zone. We spent considerable time reviewing the documented sequence of Russian command decisions during those 38 minutes. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. And yet, when you understand Russian military decision-making culture, it makes complete sense. The denial of the S-400 commander's request to fire without secondary confirmation was doctrinally correct. Russian air defense doctrine specifically prohibits unconfirmed engagement under electronic warfare conditions because of the risk of fratricide, engaging friendly aircraft misidentified as threats in a degraded sensor environment. The doctrine exists for good reasons. It was written in response to real historical incidents. And on the night of June 3rd, it functioned exactly as designed to prevent fratricide. And in doing so, it allowed Ukraine's drone package to complete its transit. Doctrine can be simultaneously correct and catastrophic. The Node Bravo operator followed his training. The S-400 commander followed his doctrine. The Russian signals chain processed the anomaly through its established assessment framework. Every individual in that chain did what they were supposed to do. And it wasn't enough. Because Ukraine had spent 11 weeks learning the exact shape of that doctrine, and had engineered an operation designed to make Russian doctrine work against itself. Here's the take that will probably generate some pushback. Russia's air defense failure over northern Crimea on June 3rd wasn't primarily a technology failure or even an intelligence failure. It was a failure of institutional adaptability. Ukraine had been conducting signals, intelligence harvesting operations against Russian air defense networks for 2 years by this point. The pattern of Ukrainian operations, passive collection followed by precision active interference, had been visible in broad strokes in open source reporting since at least mid-2025. The Russian military had the information they needed to change their operating procedures, randomize their emission cycles, and install better emission security protocols that would have made the 11-week collection effort either impossible or far less productive. They didn't do it. The bureaucratic inertia of a military organization processing a 3-year war while trying to maintain doctrinal coherence is not a small thing. But neither is the cost. What would NATO have done differently with that air defense network architecture? Would Allied forces have randomized emission cycles more aggressively, built better counter-passive collection protocols, or accepted more fratricide risk to enable autonomous engagement? Comment your analysis. This is exactly the kind of doctrinal question that modern air defense planners are arguing about right now. The fuel storage complex at Jankoy burned for 6 hours. Satellite imagery captured by commercial providers and circulated through OSINT networks showed 8 storage tanks destroyed, access roads blocked by debris, and what appeared to be secondary explosions consistent with ammunition or pressurized fuel containers. Ukrainian General Staff reports cited the destruction of approximately 2,400 metric tons of diesel fuel and 340 metric tons of military-grade lubricants, material intended to sustain Russian armored operations in the Kherson direction through the summer of 2026. Independent analysts assess the logistics impact as equivalent to a 12 to 18-day disruption of Russian resupply capacity to the Kherson front. The communications relay station that the second wave targeted presented a different damage picture. The physical infrastructure damage was less visually dramatic. A relay station doesn't burn the way a fuel depot does. But Ukrainian electronic warfare teams monitoring Russian military communications frequencies in the 48 hours following the strike reported significant degradation in traffic density across the frequencies associated with the station's relay function. Russian forces in the southern operational zone shifted to backup communications protocols. Those protocols were less encrypted, less reliable, and more susceptible to Ukrainian intercept. In the 2 weeks following the June 3rd operation, Gior reported a 31% increase in actionable intelligence derived from communications intercepts in the southern zone. The opened window didn't just let the drones through, it echoed forward. Russian garrison commanders in northern Crimea spent the days following the operation attempting to reconstruct what had happened. Intercepted communications, fragments, reviewed by Ukrainian GUR analysts and partially released in redacted form, showed a command environment that was simultaneously furious and confused. One exchange, assessed as authentic, included a senior signals officer describing the jamming event as unprecedented in its precision, specifically noting that the frequency profiles used by the Ukrainian emitters were calibrated in a way that implies direct access to our emission parameters. That assessment was correct. 11 weeks of passive collection had given Ukraine exactly that access. The Russian signals officer had identified the mechanism of the operation with reasonable accuracy. What he apparently couldn't answer was how Ukraine had obtained the collection time and the analytical capacity to build that calibration database without triggering any Russian counter-collection response. The answer was the 11-day blackout. The period of enforced silence that had begun as a defensive response to the Russian DF sweep had been retroactively incorporated into the deception plan. When the SBU cell went dark in late April, Russian signals intelligence concluded, incorrectly, that the collection asset had relocated. That conclusion meant that the final 3 weeks of collection, conducted after the cell reactivated in mid-May, happened in an environment where Russian counter-collection posture had been partially stood down. The richest and most operationally critical data, the detailed frequency parameters and operating cycle data for nodes, Foxtrot, and Kilo, was collected during those 3 weeks, in an environment that Russia had assessed as lower risk. Ukraine's operational silence had functioned as a deception operation without ever being explicitly designed as one. One detail from this operation that stuck with us. The original 11-day blackout was a reactive survival decision. The SBU cell went dark because they assessed they were about to be compromised. They weren't thinking about deception at that point. They were thinking about survival. The deception value of that silence was recognized by GIOR analysts weeks later, when they were reviewing the collection timeline and noticed the correlation between the blackout period and the subsequent reduction in Russian counter-collection activity. The operation's most elegant element was, in a sense, accidental. The Ukrainian military recognized it, documented it, and built it into the active phase of the operation's design. That capacity to recognize and exploit the unplanned is something that separates operationally sophisticated forces from those that can only execute what they explicitly planned. Ever dealt with a situation where the improvised decision turned out to be strategically more valuable than the planned one? We read every comment, because that pattern, recognizing and formalizing the accidental advantage, is one of the most consistent features of Ukrainian military adaptation throughout this war. The electromagnetic picture over northern Crimea was restored, to the extent possible, within approximately 72 hours of the June 3rd operation. Russian engineers worked quickly to assess the damaged nodes, recalibrate their systems following the jamming event, and establish interim coverage through redundant assets brought forward from reserve positions. But the restoration process itself was informative. Ukrainian SIGINT assets, not the SBU cell, which had completed its mission and was in the process of exfiltration, but other passive collection platforms, monitored the restoration activity and captured detailed emission data on the previously uncharacterized reserve assets Russia brought forward to fill the gap. Russia's emergency response to the June 3rd operation involuntarily provided Ukraine with the collection data needed to plan a follow-on operation against the reserve assets. The corridor, once opened, left behind an intelligence inheritance. The 4 radar nodes that Ukraine disrupted on the night of June 3rd were operating again within 72 hours. The 90-kilometer corridor was closed. The window had lasted 38 minutes, as planned. but northern Crimea's air defense network would never again operate with the confidence it had carried before that night. Russian operators now knew the specific character of their vulnerability: passive collection, precision active jamming, doctrinally compliant paralysis at the engagement decision point, and knew that Ukraine had already demonstrated the capacity to exploit it. That knowledge reshapes how a garrison operates. It introduces hesitation, overcaution, and procedural friction into a system that depends on speed and decisiveness to function effectively. Ukraine didn't just open a corridor for 38 minutes. Ukraine planted a permanent doubt, real tactics, real consequences, war vector. The lessons of the June 3rd operation extend well beyond Crimea. What the SBU Signals Intelligence Cell demonstrated is that electromagnetic infrastructure is not passive background. It is terrain. It can be mapped, exploited, and temporarily seized with the right tools, the right patience, and the right analytical capacity. Ukraine didn't have more drones than Russia that night. It didn't have longer-range missiles or more powerful radar. It had 11 weeks of careful observation and a team of fewer than 12 operators who understood that the most dangerous weapon in modern warfare is not the one that destroys the most. It's the one that blinds the enemy at the exact moment they need to see. The quiz answer: Ukraine disrupted 4 radar nodes simultaneously on the night of June 3rd. B is correct. Nodes Bravo, Delta, Foxtrot, and Kilo, spanning a 90-kilometer arc of the northern Crimea approach corridor. The precision of that number matters because each additional node required additional collection time to characterize and additional emitter positioning to jam effectively. 2 nodes might have created a gap too narrow for a meaningful strike package. 6 nodes would have required more active emitters than the SBU cell could field or position without detection. 4 nodes was the answer that 11 weeks of collection data supported and operational security constraints permitted. It was not the maximum ambition. It was the calibrated precision of a team that understood exactly what they needed and executed for exactly that. Was the decision to use passive jamming, blinding rather than destroying the radar infrastructure, the right tactical choice? It preserved the option to use the same corridor again and avoided the escalatory implications of a direct kinetic strike on Crimean air defense infrastructure. But it also meant the window closed. A different commander might have used the intelligence database to guide Storm Shadow missiles to the physical radar sites, destroying them entirely and opening a permanent gap rather than a 38-minute one. Which would you have chosen? Could Russian forces have prevented this? The emission security protocols that would have denied the Ukrainian collection effort existed in Russian doctrine. They were not consistently applied. More aggressive randomization of radar emission cycles, combined with better integration of counter-collection monitoring, would have made the 11-week characterization effort either impossible or too uncertain to base an active operation on. The capability existed. The institutional discipline to apply it did not. What would you have done as the Node Bravo radar operator at 1:22 a.m. on June 3rd, 2026, watching an interference pattern spread across your display that didn't match any classification in your threat library? Fire without confirmation and risk fratricide? Hold and follow doctrine and watch the corridor open? The operator who faced that choice in real time had seconds. The commanders who wrote the doctrine that constrained his choice had years. The question of where the real failure occurred is not simple. Will Ukraine attempt a similar operation against a different section of Crimea's air defense architecture in the coming months? And will Russia successfully adapt its counter-SIGINT procedures to prevent it? Comment why yes or no. The doctrinal race between passive collection and emission security is one of the defining competitions of this phase of the war. Subscribe to War Vector, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The Sivash corridor is quiet tonight. Russian radar dishes turn against a sky unmarked by contacts. The fuel depot at Zhankoy is a scorched perimeter behind a new security fence. The communications relay station has been rebuilt with hardened infrastructure. The 4 radar nodes that went dark for 38 minutes have been recalibrated and recommissioned. From the outside, everything looks restored. But somewhere in a Gur server farm in Kyiv, there is a database containing 72 hours of emission characterization data on Russia's reserve air defense assets, the ones brought forward to fill the gap on June 4th. That data is being processed. Patterns are being mapped. And somewhere in the Kherson region or somewhere else entirely, another small team of patient operators may already be listening. The wrecks at Zhankoy remain. Silent reminders that modern warfare punishes tactical mistakes without mercy. Stay vigilant.